Hello and welcome to Catholic Unscripted. I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Gavin Ashenden.
And you will see that we are one short. Mark Lambert was due to join us today, but he's had to attend another commitment on this occasion. So he'll be back with us very soon. But I meet with probably the person who can best explain what's come to our attention this week, which is that there's been an article written over at Souls and Liberty by Dr. Jules Gomez, who is he was a Vatican correspondent for Church Militant when they were running, wasn't he? And he's written an article called "Rome Moves Toward Full Communion with Orthodox Anglicans," and says here that historical events and past decrees like Apostolicae curi, which was issued in 1896 by Pope Leo XIII, declaring all Anglican ordinations to be absolutely null and utterly void, would be re-examined to the extent that they can throw light upon the facts of the present situation. Well, you and I know that Apostolicae curi was already a deep and fair and generous analysis of what was previous questions over Anglican orders. And so here we are again having the same conversation. And this comes after a video that perhaps some of you watching now will have seen that Gavin Ashenden did about Calvin Robinson's conversation with Taylor Marshall, when a number of people contacted us saying that they were left quite confused about what Calvin's orders meant in terms of Catholic. So on this occasion, people have come to us having read this article I've just mentioned now, Gavin, by Dr. Jules Gomez, saying that they're worried because they, again, are thrown into a state of confusion. So I suppose what I want to ask you is, are they right to be worried? And why has Jules written this article, do you think?
Well, Jules got given a scope, and he's a good journalist, and so journalists scoop, not scope. He got given a scoop, and so he's written it up. And I've spoken to Jules about it, saying that I had some piercing questions, and he very kindly gave me the time to answer the questions. Are they right to be worried about it? They are right to be worried about it. It's a very worrying article. Jules is a very skilled journalist, and he's made the most of the scoop. Are they worried about it? Are they right to be worried about it because it's going to happen? Not in a million years, it's not going to happen. And so I think what we need to do is to look at what's been presented, some of it's fact, some of it's assumption, some of it's prejudice, some of it's fear, and show that it isn't going to happen. And really, we're back, I'm afraid, to the same question we faced over Calvin Robinson. There are a group of people who want to be Catholic without paying the price. And the question is, how much Catholicism can they get without paying for it? And that's what this article is all about.
Well, then I want to ask you the question, Gavin. You say not in a million years. What can you say to reassure those people who have approached us with concerns and tell them why you think, in your view, this is not going to happen?
Well, I'll try and do it concisely and not boringly, but let's start off with what ecumenism is. So ecumenism to a Catholic is come home to mother. You ran out, you trashed the place, you should be sorry, the place you've built has fallen down, come back. Okay, that's ecumenism. Now, the people who run away say, a bit like the prodigal son, I'm not hungry enough to come back yet, so I want to come back on my terms. And the answer is no, you can't come back on your terms because we can't build the house like that. So this is a story about Anglicans in North America wanting to come back on their terms. And the way this works in political practice is there are a bunch of people who will call, in a friendly way, ecumeniacs. And they exist in every denomination. And there are Catholic ecumeniacs and Anglican ecumeniacs. And when these ecumeniacs find each other, they immediately get together and they have little committees together. They sit in committees and they talk avidly with each other, inventing all kinds of magical worlds in which the world looks different from reality. And then they come out of their rooms and say, look, we've written a love letter to each other. Isn't this beautiful? And everyone else says, this is a complete waste of time. It's unreal. It's posing. Stop it. So that's what we've got here. We've got some American Anglicans who are quite conservative, and they've approached Rome and they've said, what would it take for you to recognize our orders? Oh, well, we don't know, said the Catholic ecumeniacs. Let's sit down and talk about it. So this is a secret meeting that Jules has discovered. Now, the problem is what's come to light is ridden with contradictions. And unfortunately, it wouldn't have got anywhere at all if it hadn't been for Pope Francis beginning to try and change the rules and introduce the new Francis Magisterium. Because for any of this to work at all, it requires overturning the magisterium. All the common mind of the church as it's emerged, carefully and authoritatively, it has to be turned over for this to happen. Now, the Anglican ecumeniacs and the Catholic ecumeniacs are rubbing their hands together and saying, well, Francis did it with the death penalty. Maybe he'll do it with us too. And the problem is that the document they want overturned can't be overturned, partly because it's just true. The Apostolicae curi that looks at Anglican orders tells the truth about how they evolved. It says that Anglicans have got completely different definitions of priest, of bishop, of the communion service, of the church. And they're not only are they different, but they're antithetic. In other words, they're based on a repudiation of Catholicism. So this is quite a clever article. First of all, I said to Jules, come on, Jules, your headline is completely misleading. The answer is, well, it's a sub-editor's headline. And then I said, well, Rome moves towards full communion. And Jules says, well, it's a direction, isn't it? I can't argue with him. Jules is a very intelligent man. It is a direction. Then I said to Jules, come on, Jules, full communion. Pull the other one. Jules said quite rightly, winning the argument yet again, but it's got inverted commas round it, Gavin. It doesn't mean that at all. So you see, when a phrase has got inverted commas, it becomes a technical phrase. And so what we've got is a movement of direction that isn't going anywhere to achieve something that is technically impossible. And that's how you have to read the headline, which isn't Jules's anyway.
Of course, the ordinary layman isn't going to know.
No, it doesn't know that. No.
And so it's causing some concern and anxiety, which is why we're having this conversation. Carry on, sorry.
Well, that's exactly right. So thank you very much for saying that. So now if we look at what the article says, what we're told is that Jules starts by saying, in historic step, the Vatican is working towards, not going to get there, but that's a direction. Full communion, more inverted commas, because Anglicans and Catholics mean different things by that anyway and don't agree of it and will never agree of it, with conservative Anglicans by recognizing Anglican holy orders without requiring amalgamation or conversion. Now, you might think that was true, except that when you get further down, you say that it says there that Apostolicae curi will be re-examined only to the extent that it's hugely set about that it brings fresh light on the present situation. So in other words, it's not going to be overturned. It's going to remain authoritative. Well, in that case, you can't recognize Anglican orders. It's not going to happen. So there's the primary contradiction within the article. Both things are true. Apostolicae curi says it can't happen. It's true they're going to look at Apostolicae curi again, but only to remind themselves of what it says here. In which case they're not going to recognize the orders. Now, I guess even more exciting than that, Jules does something really quite clever and very alarming. So he says that originally, when in the good old days of the 1960s, when the Pope at the time and Michael Ramsey had a conversation, they decided to have an agreement called Malta I. And what Malta I said, let's have conversations which don't the answers to which are not already arrived at. So let's have exploratory conversations. And so the next 40 years, ecumeniacs got together and they talked about Mary and the Mass and the priesthood. And you may wonder how far they got. And the answer was they got absolutely nowhere. For 40 years of talking about these things, the rapprochement wasn't successful. And then, of course, in the middle of it, the Anglicans showed they weren't remotely serious and they ordained women. Now, the problem with the people we're talking about here is that the people that Jules has presented as asking for the recognition of orders are one province of North Americans who don't ordain women, except that they do ordain women. So half of them do and half of them don't. So is Rome now going to have ecumenical relationships province by province? That becomes unrealistic and very difficult, but it's the only way of doing it. And then the other question is, what on earth happens to the ordinariate? You see, if you're an Anglican and you want to be Roman Catholic and you're willing to pay the price, a door has been opened by Pope Benedict. It's a very beautiful door. It's a very good door. It's a door that enriches everybody, but you've got to become a Catholic. But you can bring some of your Anglican habits with you. And the Anglican habits are really rather lovely. They're liturgical habits, full of beautiful poetry. But in this particular case, the scenario that Jules is describing involves rubbishing the ordinariats, saying, nah, you didn't need to do this. You're not important. This isn't an achievement. We're not going to run this one anymore. We're just going to rubber stamp people and give them a dual passport on their own terms without them agreeing to anything Catholic at all. So sorry. And what Jules does, Jules then needed to get a quote from the ordinariat about this, because if he's right, it would be one of the most offensive and derogatory things that the people in the DDF could do to the ordinariat. And you won't be surprised to hear the ordinariat wouldn't talk to him on the basis of this piece of creative ecumenical writing. Of course, they're not going to talk about it because the implications are unbelievably rude. It's beneath their dignity to do it. Well, at this point, I have to say I'm slightly critical of my dear friend Jules, because of all the people he could have gone to get a comment when the ordinary won't do it, he turned to Calvin Robinson. And the difficulty is that since Calvin's last conversation with Taylor Marshall, his public credibility is not as high as it used to be. In other words, Calvin has portrayed himself as somebody, the arch example, if you like, of somebody who wants to be Catholic without actually taking the trouble to become Catholic. So he's really the last person to comment persuasively on this. But there he's in the article saying what a wonderful thing this is, and how marvelous it is, and how much it would suit me personally and everybody who thinks like me. The problem gets more complicated, because if you thought that this wasn't going very well from the Catholic side, you then discover later on in the article it's not going very well from the Anglican side either. Essentially, the Anglicans, having got very excited at the prospect of getting their passport stamped with a Catholic visa, suddenly came across fiducia supplicans. Now, if you remember, they're Orthodox Anglicans, they're conservative ones, so they don't believe in gay men marrying each other or doing intimate things with each other, because they think it's outside the remit of Christian ethics, and of course they're right. So they went to talk to Cardinal Fernandez and said, "Did you really mean fiducia supplicans?" "Goodness me, certainly not," he said. "We don't mean that at all. Wherever did you get the idea that we were going to bless gay relationships from? That's an outrageously improper theological reading." "Is it?" said the Anglicans. "Oh, well, that's all right then." And Jules says they went back contented. Well, I know the people involved in this. They're quite intelligent and astute people. I don't believe they went back contented for a moment. Essentially, it doesn't work for them from their side either. They're not going to join up and ask for a free visa if having fled gay marriage in the Episcopal Church, gone to all the trouble of setting up their own province and denomination, they suddenly discover they're walking into Tuccio Kiss-Me-Quick's new Francis magisterium, where Jimmy Martin sets the culture. They're not going to do it. So they said, well, that's all right, and they've gone back to think about it. But the thing is completely and utterly dead in the water. So the Catholics aren't going to move. The Anglicans aren't going to move. It isn't going to happen. It's founded on a whole series of contradictions. It's a very, very interesting piece of creative writing, and Jules' editors were thrilled that lots of people have clicked on it and read it. But they don't need to be worried. It's never going to happen. It's all a bit of a smoke and mirrors exercise.
It is interesting, isn't it? Thank you for that, Gavin. That was very, very interesting, and I'm sure will help answer the queries that people have come to us with. But it is interesting that in some ways the only pope that could steer in the direction that in this article Jules wants to see is the very pope that he and others might criticise for those things like fiducia supplicans. Austin Ivory, the Pope's biographer and great champion, said, well, the African bishops don't like fiducia supplicans. That's fine. They're Africans. You know, they're a bit behind the times, but don't worry. That's okay. They can do their thing. We'll do ours. Things will be different. And, you know, all that kind of divisive nonsense. And it does. And it starts to seem a bit like, well, the cherry picking and the cafeteria Catholicism that is the only kind of Catholicism that would lead to these sorts of moves, which is, well, can we have this without making this sacrifice? And can we have this without making this sacrifice? So I think what I'm trying to say is Jules, my understanding is Jules and Calvin too, and others like that, Orthodox Christians, under any other circumstances, and on any other matter would actually be quite critical of the current papacy, the current pontificate, Pope Francis, because he has been perhaps ambiguous or lax, it seems, on areas that they feel need to be absolute and tough. But because it also suits them that he's got that flexibility that fits what they like, then on this occasion it's okay. And am I right? Am I reading that right?
Yes, you are. I'm not going to talk about Jules's mind but Jules is working as a reporter, and there's a difference between reporting something and an opinion piece. And on the whole, what Jules would say he's doing is he's simply reporting other people's stupidity. He's entitled to do that. They have been stupid. He's reported it. It looks alarming and stupid. It is. It's not Jules's fault. But on the other hand, what Calvin has done publicly, so Calvin does write opinion pieces. He has lots of opinions. And one of the things he said to Taylor Marshall is this, one of the reasons I don't want to become a proper Catholic is because of the Pope. And so, the rest of us then say, well, cheer up, old chap. You've got to grin and bear it. Popes come and go. You've got to be courageous and take the rough with the smooth. This is a difficult period of time, but it's worth it because the Catholic Church is the church that Jesus founded, and it is what it says on the box. However, the problem is just as you've described it. Having said that, Calvin and others then use, if you like, the post-modernity of Pope Francis and say, this suits us awfully well because it means that rules that would otherwise have excluded us can be overturned because the Pope doesn't keep the rules. The Pope isn't interested in the magisterium. He wants a new magisterium. So if he can change the teaching on the death penalty, why can't he overturn Apostolicae curi? And I think the answer to that is that Pope Francis's time is limited. These ecumenical ventures anyway take a very long time. He's going to be dead before that happens. And most of us are convinced that the cardinals who are not yet, the cardinals are still Catholics, even if the Pope isn't. And they're not going to elect somebody who's going to continue this disastrous run of chaos and subjectivity. So at that point, it will stop. And somebody in the DDF will say, do you know what? We're not going to go down the route of saying you can believe what you like and still be a Catholic. You can join us on any terms you like that suit you, but are anti-Catholic. You can have a reading of history that suits your fantasies, but is actually untrue. So it won't get very far. I mean, Jules has done us a favor by exposing these fantasy conversations, bringing them into the light, and then allowing us to test them. And as we test them in terms of Catholic thinking, Catholic teaching, and the magisterium, they fall flat on their face. And but I dare say they're pleasant to have for the people who get together and see in each other the people we call ecumaniacs, a common fantasy for living in a world of unreality where nobody pays the price for anything.
I do like that, ecumeniacs. That's in fact the first time I've heard the use of that word. Did you make it up, Gavin?
No, and I have no original ideas, Katherine. I borrowed all my ideas from other people, and almost all of my language. Well, no, I would say all of my language too. I've just tried to keep the most useful stuff and let go of the stuff that doesn't work. So it's just the magpie effect, I'm afraid.
Well, wherever you borrowed your language from, it's always very welcome, and people find your clarity is much needed and valued. I know somebody who said they had arguably slightly tenuous grounds for an annulment, and I remember the conversation they had where they said we better hurry up and get an application for an annulment in while Pope Francis is still alive, because we think we might have more luck. And there was that sense, whether that's true or not, of course, but that was the sense that one had, which brings me to another question that's come in from some of our viewers. In fact, from a couple of people, but the question can be summed up thus. How is this different from a group of Catholics who were hoping to see a move that we saw in Amoris Laetitia for divorced Catholics to receive communion? In other words, it was Catholics saying, look, we make all these steps, all these sacrifices, but that's one too far, and we just want the church to shift a little bit to allow us to receive communion as divorced Catholics. It's not asking a lot. It's just a tiny little move. Please, could they do that? We're otherwise faithful. We're otherwise good. But can it shift? And there was a huge furore over the question of divorced Catholics receiving communion. And again, this is presented as this is just a small matter. It wouldn't take much again, can there be just a small shift to allow this? We're not asking much. Is there a difference, would you say? And if so, what is the difference in those two hopes, the hopes of those who want to see full communion with Rome without perhaps the necessary sacrifices, and the hopes of those who want to receive communion as divorced Catholics without making the necessary costs and sacrifices there?
So part of that question is easy and part of it's very difficult. So the easy part is that this is people outside Catholicism wanting to break down the wall so they can walk through instead of going through the gate. Jesus is very clear that breaking down the wall and not coming through the gate is not something that he endorses. So that's it. That's easy. The more difficult bit is that what the business of giving communion to divorced Catholics can be portrayed in a number of different ways. And like everything else, everything depends upon your, if you like, your epistemological hierarchy. In other words, the way you rank things that are important to you. I think one of the things that's enormously important in our culture is the sanctity of marriage. And so anything that undermines the sanctity of marriage is going to be anti-Catholic and anti-Christian and weaken the Christian position in relation to a society that has gone completely rogue and anarchic. And so although it would be nice and kind to say, let's change the rules, the way the Catholic Church has dealt with it at the moment is to have a very generous attitude to annulment. Effectively, it looks at a marriage and looks for defects that might be traced back to the beginning. And very many marriages are capable and should be annulled. But the Catholic Church has always said, if the marriage is valid, legitimate, in that case, there's a price to be paid for breaking it. So I think we're probably back to paying the price for things again. And it's taken the view that the price is too great to change on this matter. It's nice for people who are asking for it, but a bit like euthanasia, the people who get it on their own terms certainly do well out of it. But the consequences for everybody else are really quite serious, and the price becomes too high. So that's the way I would describe it.
Yes, it's worth saying that an annulment is not a declaration that the marriage has ended. It's not, as some people call it, a Catholic divorce. So it is a process. It goes through canon law and you present your case, which goes back to the beginning and says, at the beginning, this marriage was invalid. So a marriage has to be valid and there have to be certain conditions met for that marriage to be valid. Now, if you can go back to the roots and say, actually, those conditions were not met at the time of making the vows, perhaps there was coercion involved, perhaps there was deceit at the time of making the vows, things were hidden that later came to light and are perfectly clear. And it's not the same as saying after valid vows were made, there has been, a disability or an injury or a change of behaviour that makes the marriage difficult. That's very difficult, of course, and sad. But it's always about that point that the vows were made. So either the marriage is valid or it's invalid. Then once a Catholic receives an annulment from the church, which is a document that states with the authority of the church that the marriage never took place, although the years were lived in the marriage in a marital state, that the church confirms that marriage never took place, then the Catholic, let's say in the UK, has to then have a civil divorce. That's a separate matter. That's a civil issue. And the divorce can be given. And then the Catholic can marry again. Then the Catholic can marry, but it's not considered marrying again because, of course, there was no prior marriage in the church. So the Catholic could have a Catholic marriage and it would be considered their first marriage. So in that case, of course, you can receive communion. So, of course, divorced Catholics can receive communion if they fulfill that criteria. but the question was over whether you might not have had an annulment, had a civil divorce, remarried in a civil wedding, but still a Catholic and want to receive communion. That's a separate issue. So it all comes down to whether the church has confirmed that you were not married, because there is no end to marriage. That's it. You're married. It's lifelong, life-giving, exclusive, and that's the end of it. That doesn't change. Yes.
I don't mean to make this a leitmotif, but again, it's about paying the price. Asking for an annulment is not an easy business at all. You engage in a process of examination where people you've never met before ask you the most personal and the most difficult questions. But once again, it's a matter of paying the price. And I think I'm more and more convinced that one of the virtues of being a Roman Catholic is that if you're willing to pay the price to become one, the act of the sacrifice, at every point, a sacrifice, a small death, if you like, is almost always asked in order to live the resurrected life. It's the Jesus pattern. It's the gospel pattern. Some people think of it as complain it's legalistic, or that there are too many rules, or that it's over hierarchical. But actually, one of the things the Orthodox show us is that there is a hierarchy in the kingdom of heaven. The rules do matter. Jesus was very clear about not a jot or tittle of the law being swept away in some kind of kindly free for all. So I'm very aware that people have criticized the Catholic Church for what they call legalism, but I sometimes think they misattribute the virtues of what the church tries to do, and very often it's a matter of, are you willing to pay the price for what you want to achieve?
Yes, you're right, that legalism, because if you think about what it means, I think it's a lack of understanding of the sacramental. If you say, well, we got married, it was an accident, we got divorced, we made a mistake, and now we just want to go back to church, well, and go back to receive Jesus in the Eucharist. Well, that can't happen, because sacramentally, if the church doesn't say that there was no marriage in the first place, you are forever married. So it doesn't matter what you do in your civil life and what the state says you are. It doesn't, the status the state gives you. In the eyes of the church, you remain married until there's a way of declaring that you were never married. So it's not legalism, because what it is it's saying this is just the way it is. This is how sacraments work. This is making something invisible visible. Now, what we can do is say, actually, that visible one fleshness never happened in the first place. That's another matter. But to try and claim that it did, and now everything's fine and I'm married to someone else, is logically inconsistent. If you understand what that means, you cannot be one flesh with two different people. You can't live a polygamous life. And that's really, really important. So I think it's like the reason social justice matters or is even efficacious is because of the social doctrine that underlies it. So all of the ways in which we seek to love others and to be self-giving and to be generous and to care and to be compassionate are possible because we have an underlying set of truths that make it so. Now, if we just ignore those truths or try and rip them apart or throw them in the air, then it becomes empty, I suppose. I know Bishop Barron often talks about this, and he says once you get rid of, let's say, the importance of the Eucharist, the importance of Christ, the importance of the real presence in communion, and you say, well, I'm a good person, I do this, I do that, I give to charity, I walk for cancer research, I help the homeless, but I don't bother so much with going to mass, that once that erodes, then all the rest will start to erode. You will err in your social justice. And we see it as we begin with good intentions and they end up allowing two men to purchase a baby and treat humans as a commodity in IVF and surrogacy, and we start to expand all those things that we think are nice because our own vision of what's nice has replaced God's vision of what's good. So I think that's why the law matters. That's why what's true matters. And then if we see that that's lived out, no matter how hard it is and no matter what the cost is, and there will be a cost, that it's always the better thing, it's always the more beautiful thing, and it's always the thing that makes us happier in the end, although we might not be able to see it in the immediate.
That's right. Yep. Thank you. That puts it very clearly.
But does it? I feel like it put it about as clear as a cup of mud. But
Well, I think we're talking about very difficult matters here. We're talking about there's a scale, isn't there? We're talking about people's motivation. We're talking about having to live your life forwards, but only understanding it backwards. We're talking about the way in which people get married without any proper foundation for doing it. We're talking about the very delicate balance between forgiveness and faithfulness, and these things all exist on a scale. One of the reasons why I find ethics very hard. So I think you've done a very clear job of describing the complexities of these scales that we all live on, and ask for God's help to keep our balance on.
Well, God is infinitely merciful, but we have to throw ourselves at his mercy. We can't demand he, like the father in the house, comes trampling through the streets looking for the son in the pig muck. I mean, we have freedom, don't we? We have free will, but he waits, longing to gather us up in his arms as we just get to the end of the driveway, but we have to make that move. So of course the mercy is there, but we have to call upon that mercy in the way that God shows us and teaches us.
I do think the prodigal son gives us, I think it's proper to use it as an analogy for some of the things we've been talking about in terms of becoming a Catholic. The prodigal son has to leave the place he thought was better, that he'd invested himself in mistakenly, and come back and say, "Oh, look, I'm really sorry, I was wrong. Yeah. This is a failed experiment. On what terms will you have me back? I'll come back on any terms."
Yeah.
And then the father is generous and says, "Let's have a party." Yeah. But I'm afraid, for me, ecumenism is, we have to say to the Protestants, you've made a terrible mess of this. You've distorted Catholic teaching. You've misrepresented it. You've allowed the enemy to muddle your minds. You've not produced the goods. It hasn't worked. The Holy Spirit's continued to work in a supernatural way in the Catholic Church, producing miracles and saints without number and without end. Say you're sorry, come back, and give your energies back to the Church, because without you we're poorer. But don't ask the Church to meet you halfway or to meet you in the pigsty, because that's a misinterpretation of the value. So I'm afraid, in all the things we've talked about, this ecumeniac fantasy with the ACNA and the issues that Calvin raised earlier on about having Catholicism on his own terms, I think the answer from the prodigal son is no, come back, say you're sorry, and pay the price.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you for meeting with me today, Gavin, and for having this conversation. And I hope that eases the anxiety of some people who have been confused or left uncertain in any way by this article that they've read. As always, do contact us on info@catholicunscripted.com with any questions you might have. For our members, we'll be doing a members video very soon. We'll send an email with a date for that. And if you haven't already, please visit our website, catholicunscripted.com, and check out the memberships at Silver and... What's that?
No, I was just about to do exactly what you're doing. We would so love you to become members, and particularly silver and gold members, because you then get access to the daily conversations that Katherine and I have, where we pool our astonishing resources and throw light onto the opaque world of politics and secularity with an enthusiasm that will see you through the week, and all, as Katherine says, for the price of a cup of coffee a month, or, as I put it, for those of you who have different dietary attractions, a couple of Eccles cakes.
Yeah, we have had some emails saying, "What on earth is an Eccles cake?" And we have to remember that not all our viewers are in the UK, and certainly not limited to the north of the UK, at least. Anyway, but so we've said various things: a sugared donut, 8 sticks of celery, whatever your preference is, for a reasonable amount. We hope that you think this is really good value for money, and it really does help us sustain what we do. In fact, without it, we could not do this. Simple as that. So if you think that what we're doing is valuable in any way, if you find it helpful, then please do consider becoming a member. And you'll hear, Gavin, we have some lovely conversations, don't we? They're anywhere between 10 and 30 minutes every day. There's the odd exception if you have an event, or if I have something that means we can't. But on the whole, about 28 broadcasts a month. And we really do enjoy our conversations. They're often quite light, although we're sometimes dealing with quite heavy issues. A lot of things in politics at the moment with the upcoming UK election and the upcoming US election, and all the things going on in the Middle East and so on. So the news is obviously quite serious, but I'd like to think that we take a reasonably hopeful and light-hearted approach when appropriate, don't we?
We do. I don't want to be too pompous or self-referential, but one of the reasons why prayer works is because every day you put yourself in a place in front of the living God, and you sacrifice time, and you let God reshape you through the Psalms and through the prayers and through your relationship. And so the amount of time that you give to God is proportionate to the amount of reshaping he can do. And I found something similar with our conversations. I think there's a great deal to be said to giving time to bringing the Catholic faith to bear on the complexities of politics and daily news. And it's not to say that either of you or I are hugely gifted and insightful. Well, you are, but I'm not. But it is to say that the exercise itself is really worth doing. And I find the time that we give to it is time that's, compared to the other things I do, is really well spent, and I'm very grateful for it. So I'm grateful for it, and I hope other people can benefit from it too.
Yeah, well, they do seem to. You're a great gift to the church, Gavin, and to me and Mark in the friendship that we have developed over the years. So thank you for watching this broadcast, and do please check out the website. But for now, hopefully returning with Mark Lambert very soon. I'm Katherine Bennett.
I'm Gavin Ashenden, and Mark Lambert. Come back. All is forgiven. We need you.
Yeah, we do need you.